Good evening. My name is Jennifer Kerslake, and I'm the Manager of Community Engagement at Medicine Hat College. It is our absolute pleasure to join you in your living rooms or from your kitchen tables tonight for this very important community conversation. Although we are physically disconnected from one another, please know that there are hundreds of other parents and caregivers who are tuning in right now to join you and all of us here in this conversation. Here with me tonight are our education and law enforcement partners on the Southeast Alberta Regional Violence, Threat, Risk Assessment and Intervention Protocol Committee, also known as VITRA. The creator and VITRA model of the VITRA model and the guiding light of our community committee is here with us as well, Mr. Kevin Cameron, Executive Director of the North American Center for Threat Assessment and Trauma Response. I'd like to introduce our other partners on stage. From Medicine Hat Public School Division, Superintendent Mark Davidson. Associate Superintendent Tracy Hansel. Division Psychologist Claire Peterson. From Prairie Rose School Division, Superintendent Roger Clark. Deputy Superintendent Dr. Reagan Weeks. Division Psychologist Greg Goddard. From Medicine Hat Catholic Board of Education, Dwayne Zarichny, Superintendent. Hugh Lair, Associate Superintendent. From Cape School, Teresa Danino, Superintendent. From Medicine Hat College, President and CEO Kevin Shufflebotham. From the Medicine Hat Police Service, Inspector Brent Secondiak. From Redcliffe RCMP, Detachment Commander Sean Maxwell. And as mentioned earlier, Kevin Cameron. There are many vital community partners who are also a part of the Regional VITRA Committee. All board trustees, the Southern Francophone Education Region School Board, the City of Medicine Hat, Alberta Health Services, Addictions and Mental Health, Canadian Mental Health Association, McMahon Youth, Family and Community Services, Sexual Assault Response Committee, Southeastern Alberta Regional Suicide Prevention Council, and Child and Family Services. I'd now like to introduce Hugh Lair, who is the chairperson for our Regional VITRA Committee.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to start with a story, and part of the story that goes with it is the reason I wear this starfish on my lapel. You may have heard it before, but a young man is walking along the ocean and sees a batch of thousands and thousands of starfish washed up on the shore. Further up the beach, he sees an old man that's walking along and he's picking up starfish occasionally and chucking them back in the ocean. He says, "Why are you throwing them back in the ocean?" He says, "Well, the sun's coming up, the tide's going out, and if I don't throw them back in, they'll die." "But old man, don't you realize there are tens of thousands of starfish? You'll never be able to save them all, and all your efforts won't make any difference." The old man calmly bent down and picked up another starfish and chucked it back into the sea and said, "It won't make a difference for that one." So welcome this evening. You may or may not know, but we have a committee in Medicine Hat and Southeast region called the Southeast Alberta Violence Threat Risk Assessment Protocol, or known as VITRA. I chair and co-chair with Tracy Hansel this committee. It is a group of committed adults, committed school boards, our members. We've got our community agencies, police partners, RCMP, Alberta Health Services, that are members because they're all caring members of our community and committed to making our schools and communities safe. The protocol ensures that there's a common understanding of the VITRA process, and it encourages the development of common responses and emphasizes a multidisciplinary approach. A multidisciplinary team offers a more complete understanding of all the dynamics that are involved in the lives of the individuals, the families, and our community. And it better reflects the consideration of the context of risk and the impact of those that are identified. The impact of our local traumatic events and other factors, including things like the pandemic, has significantly impacted our families and our youth and our broader community. This impact and the level of risk has warranted the activation of our protocol, but on a larger community scale. The protocol supports a collective leadership role of all adults in our community. Like I referred to, we have our school leadership. Behind me, we have board chairs. In front of me, we have our police partners. All school boards are signing members of the protocol. Community agencies like McMahon, Alberta Health Services, CMHA, I sure hope I'm not forgetting anyone. Sark, thank you. Our members, but more importantly, we want to include our teachers, our learning assistants, our parents, and most importantly, our children and youth. We want them to have a leadership role to help reduce the risk and reflect the safe, caring, and restorative approaches. We want to educate each other on best practice, find possible interventions, and identify pathways to local support services. To help us do this, and the creator of the model, we've reached out to a valuable partner who trains members of our community, Kevin Cameron, the executive director. He trains, we have myself included, Greg Goddard with Prairie Rose, Lisa Lindsay and Jenna Bentley with SD76. Kevin trains us to reach out and train members of our community in the VITRA process. So we're very thankful that we have this expert in the field of trauma response to consult with our community and consult with our VITRA protocol. We're so thankful for his support and guidance. So welcome, Kevin.
Good evening, folks. So as noted, I'm Kevin Cameron, Executive Director, North American Center for Threat Assessment and Trauma Response. I'm a born and bred Nova Scotia boy, like everybody know that, in case you're wondering why I say a few of the things that I do. And I wish we're all in this room together, because no doubt I'm not the only East Coaster, if you will, attached to the Medicine Hat region. But our particular purpose tonight, I want to clarify something as well. That although we've utilized the VITRA committee to pull all of us together, that in actuality, part of the work of the multidisciplinary collaboration is to deal with trauma also, including the dynamics of suicide. And so we wanted to make it real clear that although the name violence is in the protocol, it was actually developed in a way to really focus on any dynamics that might elevate risk. And one of the standards actually is that serious violence is an evolutionary process, and that suicide likewise is an evolutionary process of just a lot of things going wrong, if you will, that converge together that allows somebody to cross that line. And our purpose tonight here is to basically do something that I've counseled for years in other regions also, which is that we have to activate what I call the adult system. That means not just the professionals, my colleagues behind me and others, those in front as well that you can't see, but that is also activating parents and caregivers. And we thought in terms of this region right here, that education has the power, along with other partners, to really be able to pull together a lot of the adults to understand and learn from each other what might actually be occurring, that allows, if you will, dynamics to occur, both in relation to suicide and even contagion, if you will, that says, why another one, why another one? And so we want to be able to actually intervene in a way that I promise you we can. While this was for parents and caregivers, I'm not naive. I'm the father of 3 kids as well. And I always joke that my firstborn, Mitch, was 11 pounds, 3 ounces and a month premature. And he played football down here back in the day, high school football also, big old Mitch. When he graduated from high school a couple of years ago, he rounded out at 6'3", 330 pounds. By the way, you're probably looking at me, the camera. If it adds 10 pounds, then you might be wondering if I am actually the father, but I promise you I am. And but he's an Alberta-born boy, and I always joke with my maritime friends that we grow him big out west. It must be all that beef, if you will. And plain and simple, though, I know that there are some students and some kids who are sitting with your parents watching this also. And so that's okay. We're not talking anything that's inappropriate. But the messages tonight are for parents and caregivers. Why? Because the reality is the kids, we've been trying to stay connected to them. But we know, and a lesson learned comes from a situation that some of you are aware of. And that would be if I take you to the West Coast and we look at Amanda Todd. That name should ring a bell, because Amanda Todd is the young woman who attended Coquitlam School District, and prior to dying by suicide, she used a series of flashcards, and she told her story on YouTube before taking her life. And what we had to deal with in the aftermath of that was an unbelievable amount of symptom development. We had kids going into risk. We had adults who could identify with her story, likewise going into risk. And so it left us determining, what are we supposed to do here with this circumstance? And one of the things that hit me as I gathered all of our colleagues together in the Lower Mainland is that the professionals were being crushed under the weight of trying to figure out how to reach out to all these kids and adults that we were concerned with. And me, because of my background, I'm kind of unique in my perspective, but I promise you that we've been able to slow and eliminate, if you will, dynamics associated with suicide by doing what we're doing tonight as a starting point. And that is this. In my background, obviously I do work in high-end violence risk assessment, but I also work in crisis and trauma response and dealing with the impact that profound loss and tragedy can have, not just on individuals and a family, but schools, workplaces, and an entire region like here in Medicine Hat and beyond. And so while I work in that field, I also do work in the field of crisis and trauma response. So that meant that in the aftermath of Amanda Todd's suicide, I, along with my colleagues in the BC government, took a leadership role. And we recognized we have got to get parents and caregivers involved in this thing if we want to slow this down and put a stop to it. But also, I am uniquely different from many of my other colleagues in that I am trained also in family therapy. So I'm a master level family therapist, and I promise you folks, it all has to do with these things. And after Amanda's suicide, because so many kids went into risk, we decided that it was appropriate to host 2 large parent meetings. By the way, it was interesting. Some of my professional colleagues didn't think that the parents would show up. And I called that that's actually wrong. Sorry, the maritime in me has some other words I was going to use, but you know, we got a dignified affair going on here. But I said, folks, I am telling you, the parents and caregivers often are concerned about what's going on, but they will wait to see what the professionals are going to do. So what is mental health going to say? What is the schools going to say? What are the other partners saying? And it's almost as if we don't say anything, then some parents think, I guess, then saying nothing is what we should do. But I'm here to tell you folks that there's a lot that we should say. There's a lot that we should do. And so in Amanda Todd's case, there were hundreds and hundreds of parents that came. I share with my colleagues here behind me and others that the dominant questions that I get asked here in Woodstock, where we dealt with this situation in Ontario, in Saskatchewan, elsewhere in the province of Alberta, and other places that I won't bother to tell you about, suffice it to say, as the parents rolled in, it was evident that there were 2 dominant questions on their mind. Number 1, what should I say to my kids? If I need to reach out and connect with them and I'm part of the solution, what should I say? And the second one is, what should I do? Those 2 became dominant themes that my colleagues gleaned questions from you folks that came in droves. I'm just very, very pleased with how parents and caregivers responded and gave insights. And I'm not going to address those yet. Instead, I'm going to lay the foundation for some things that we know about crisis and trauma response, especially high-profile tragedies of which you have dealt with in your community. And so for the families of those who have lost loved ones from suicide, plain and simple, our hearts go out to you. And we certainly recognize that when it becomes high profile and you know that other people are watching and wondering and have their own ideas about what happened here, what happened there, that for our purposes tonight, we're not delving into any particular individual circumstance. We're really delving into the dynamics as relates to your community and region, which is that several suicides have occurred that have without a doubt left a weight and a dynamic. So I want to introduce something that many of you might not have been anticipating that I was going to share tonight or was going to come out of this meeting. But we have a jingle, and as a maritime boy, I got all kinds of jingles. And one of them is that the higher the anxiety, the greater the symptom development. What that means is any individual who is stressed, if you will, that we have predictable signs and symptoms that we might generate. Those of us in families get to know each other quite well, so that a family member can claim, I'm fine, but you know they're not actually fine. Oh, by the way, I should tell you, I'm also a trained marital therapist to boot. And oh, by the way, we know all kinds about marital dynamics and how we might try, if you will, to suggest everything's fine when we know it isn't. So the higher the anxiety, the greater the symptom development. Applies to individuals, but it applies to families also, who have heightened anxiety, and all of a sudden we are doing, saying, thinking, and feeling things that maybe as a family we haven't even done before. But schools, workplaces, and entire communities can likewise have their anxiety elevated and thus symptom development. What I was alluding to that you were maybe not expecting me to talk about is that I have spent a lot of time with my colleagues, Dr. Marlene Wong from the University of Southern California, Dr. William Pollack from Harvard University, and others, and my many Canadian colleagues as well, because I'm a proud Canadian boy, let me tell you. But we put together a comprehensive set of guidelines, first of all, to assist with re-entry into the school setting during the pandemic. And then we have broadened our work to understanding the social, emotional, and traumatic impact of COVID-19. And I'm not even talking the virus. I'm just talking the dynamics associated in society with what has occurred because of the virus, with quarantining, with job loss, and all the other things that have occurred. And so one of the standards that we use in our work is what we call the crisis and trauma response continuum. And that continuum I'm going to present generically, and then we're going to take it and distill it into suicide and suicide prevention. When we started to see the virus hit the shores of North America, then we recognized that on the continuum of response, there are some people who are perfectly okay. By the way, I see that even in Medicine Hat when I've been down here a few times, by the way, over the past few weeks, that even as we apply COVID-19, there are some people out there who have no anxiety associated with the pandemic. They don't feel they're going to get the virus, or if they do, they're healthy enough that they'll be able to fight it off. They're doing okay. But we recognize that there are other individuals out there who actually had acute responses when the virus hit, and their anxiety shot up. They had profound symptom development, and over a couple of weeks, they accommodated to it. And they're fine now. They've just got through that first, if you will, initial anxiety, and they've settled down. There are other folks out there that are kind of slow burns, what I call over-functioners, who are so busy taking care of everybody else that they haven't had time to really consciously let us settle in just how much of a burden a worldwide pandemic has been on our overall functioning. And then there's a few folks that actually it has generated trauma symptoms in them because of maybe historical illnesses. Maybe you parents or caregivers, when you were a child, you maybe had to take care of an ailing parent who passed away from an illness or a respiratory illness. And all of a sudden you find yourself in adulthood wondering, why is this pandemic bothering me so much when our numbers have been low in this particular area? And yet it often can come back to a childhood dynamic that is manifest. The reason why I'm presenting this idea of a crisis and trauma response continuum is because the same thing applies when death occurs, even by suicide, is that we have some individuals in the community, maybe even in a larger family of origin, who, although saddened by a loss, are doing okay. And I want you to know, folks, I actually don't want everybody to be traumatized. That there are some folks who are doing okay, that's good, because they can be there to take care of others. Some of you parents and caregivers on this call, I've been doing this long enough to know, there might be a few years wondering why we're even doing this. But the reality is that there are always individuals struggling at different points in time who need to know that even if somebody is doing okay, they can still be present to help somebody who is struggling. Likewise, there may be some families out there, if you will, with acute responses upon hearing the news that there has been another death and then another one, who have settled down okay and they're doing all right. Yet there may be others in families and within the community who are bearing a great burden because of this. One of the lessons learned in the field of violence threat risk assessment, which Hugh was doing a little bit of an overview on, is that we know that when high-profile violence occurs, that we need to pay attention to those in our particular sphere who may be focusing a lot on the news of that particular high-profile violent tragedy. And if we have somebody who's troubled, who's maybe thought about violence themselves, then we say the more that a person can identify with the aggressor who's being highlighted in the media, the more it will increase their symptom development. Because identification with the aggressor can add to what we call the justification process for violence. But we apply the same dynamic to suicide, which is why we're using the protocol to bring us all together. Is it likewise, when a suicide occurs, and especially when it is high profile, when the individuals are well known in the community, etc., and then details begin to seep out, if you will, or even in particular, when people believe they know why something occurred, then what happens from a community perspective is that those individuals caught within what we call the impact zone of that tragedy, whether they knew the individuals or not, the more that a person who's already been struggling with depression, suicidality, etc., the more they can identify with the deceased, the more it will increase their symptom development. So we call it an identification process that once it begins, then it begins to intensify, if you will, and we see some of what we have seen here in this particular region. So then the solution, though, actually becomes we can either treat each incident as an individual tragedy, which, by the way, for the families and others close by, it should be. But once we get into 2 or 3 deaths in close proximity, we need to treat it as a dynamic. We need to understand that there's a particular degree of identification with, and it can become somewhat self-perpetuating until us adults come together first. And one of the things that we have actually learned is that the pandemic itself, we already knew would elevate anxiety. And so if you have a child, if you have an adult who maybe unbeknownst to some of us was 80%, we'll say, committed, where they've actually been thinking about taking their own lives, but they just haven't felt comfortable to tell anybody that they're struggling in this fashion. Oh, and by the way, imagine if you're an over-functioner, and that is a family therapy dynamic we use a lot, over-functioners, under-functioners. If you're an over-functioner as well, who is bearing this great burden of trying to take care of everybody else, how do you possibly ask for help if we have this almost inhuman standard that says we're supposed to suck it up and move on? Using, by the way, the crisis and trauma response continuum, I want you to know that one of the things that has actually stood in the way sometimes of us slowing down, if you will, these tragedies when they have occurred, is the good old suck it up and move on routine. And I'm here to tell you, folks, that you don't know for sure what's really going on in somebody's heart or in their head. And everybody can have a difficult time in life where if they don't have at least one person they feel confident in reaching out to, then if they bear the weight on their own, it may very well crush them. And I'm kind of down for a more modern version because having 3 kids, all who were athletes, all bigger than me, by the way, I'm not quite sure what happened there, but being with my kids and seeing sort of the jock world also, and by the way, jock can be good or evil. I like the coaches, I like the folks out there that are raising fine young men, young women, young human beings, if you will, to be skilled and athletic, if you will, to be strong in personality, but also to be open about the real human condition that we're dealing with. Because one of the things that has occurred during the pandemic is actually that a lot of losses happened that we maybe haven't really been as open about as possible. Because you see, we communicated months ago that we knew once we went into quarantine the first time, we were going to have an increase in suicidality, in violence, in child abuse, in drug and alcohol abuse, et cetera, et cetera. And in different regions, we have seen that. It's that added layer on top of those who are maybe already 80% committed or struggling with whether or not to do it. And quarantine, of course, has disconnected some of us, but it has also done this particular thing. It disrupted what in family therapy we call the closeness-distance cycle. And although I cannot give a deep definition of this, I am going to give you a little insight, but I want you to know, first of all, folks, that this meeting that we're holding here tonight really was considered by all of us who organized this to be a first step. And so what I've told my colleagues too is none of us need to be so anxious thinking that we actually have an hour and a half and we better get in everything we need to, or else there'll never be another opportunity. Another jingle of mine is treat the big things big and the little things little. This is big enough to warrant all of us to be on this stage, to be here in front of me, and it is certainly big enough for the hundreds of parents and caregivers to be on this call. And so this is step one. We may very well have a second meeting where we get to address further questions, if you will, and answer those. What should I say? What should I do? Especially as you and we gain more insight, courtesy of even this meeting. But one of the areas that has added complexity and risk is what we call an impaired closeness-distance cycle. And it is very much related to quarantining, but it generated symptoms that in the end, folks, still exist for some families and individuals. It goes like this. Every particular human connection where we care for somebody, so parents with each other, parents with their children, siblings as well in their connections, we actually require a certain degree of proximity with each other, what we sometimes call intense physical closeness, where we're together, where we feel securely attached. And yeah, we use that term clinically, but you don't need to be a therapist in order to understand that. That a secure attachment says, I'm safe with this person, they love me, and even, by the way, with our spots and blemishes, that we're still cared about in this particular family unit. Well, then the closeness phase of the closeness-distance cycle is actually one where we enjoy being together so much that the proximity lowers our anxiety. Oh, but don't worry, folks. It's called a closeness-distance cycle because there has to be distance also built in it. I joke with many folks, and I wish we could be in the room so we could see everybody's faces as well. But the Maritimer in me likes to joke that one of the biggest screw-ups that parents make is that they decide one year to go on the week-long holiday. Oh, by the way, so you know, if you got young kids, the week-long holiday, by the time you're halfway through, then you see why I also specialize in violence risk assessment, because we're thinking of doing some terrible things to our kids after that much closeness. But you know, the kiddies get older, like mine and my wife's Carrie, who, by the way, she's the born and bred Albertan, I'm the Maritimer. And the kids get older, and then you make a mistake. You decide, you know, we finally had a 1 week holiday, and it actually went quite good. So you're thinking, you know what? We should go for 2 weeks this summer. Folks, give your head a shake. The friggin' 2 week holiday is the kiss of death. Don't do it. The reality is that anybody who's tried it, oh, the first week might have been fine, but the second week it was clear that too much closeness elevates the anxiety. Here's the closeness-distance cycle, and there is something really profound about what I'm about to tell you, is that the closeness phase lowers our anxiety for a period of time, but after we have enough closeness, actually the anxiety begins to build, and our bodies begin to say, I love them, but I'm sick of them, and we need a distance phase. I guess actually pandemic's perfect for that, because look at the distance we got here even with these characters. And so the reality is that the distance phase has to occur to allow our anxiety to go down. And then you want to know what happens? As we distance, i.e. the kids go to school, the parents and caregivers go to work, or whatever it may be, then there's enough time away that often we now want to be back together again. And so this here phase is how families manage anxiety, and folks didn't even realize it, but here's the problem. The pandemic and quarantining, it impaired the closeness-distance cycle. And what it did was it forced families together, and then it added additional stress too, i.e. a parent or caregiver losing their job, going on CERB, having less income, if you will. And what about this? Not to get too clinical on you, But what if there was a particular marriage or a relationship system where, to be quite frank, the way that the parents and caregivers stayed functional is that he, she, or they, one of them, actually had a job that took them away quite a bit. So there was natural distance, and now all of a sudden they are forced together with no reprieve. Then we have seen what has happened in some families is that it has rekindled, if you will, sometimes symptoms of individuals or the entire family, or it has exposed symptoms that have lied dormant. What I mean by this is, let's say that you could have a particular family, and now I'm talking everybody on this call. And by the way, what I'm saying here isn't just for Medicine Hat and region. I've been zooming in and meeting with government officials, school jurisdictions, community agencies all across North America, including my colleagues in Los Angeles not that long ago, yesterday with a group from Saskatchewan. I was on a call, by the way, with colleagues from New Brunswick. So this is not about you. This is about everybody. It's just that it can be manifest, if you will, obviously anywhere, including here. Because sometimes what happens is symptoms can lay dormant, including this. If there was a marriage that started off the first 2 years with an immature couple who actually had been violent with each other, then I'm here to tell you they maybe worked through it before they ever had kids, and lo and behold, nothing has ever happened again. Somehow a miracle happened, and they never crossed that line. It's wonderful. They've got now 3 kids, we'll say, who are all school-aged. By the way, those kids didn't even realize that they entered into a home where violence had been at the foundation in the first 2 years before they came along. But then comes the pandemic, because by the way, folks, we're only human. And I'm here to tell you, the higher the anxiety, the greater the symptom development. And so the pandemic comes. By the way, he loses his job. His anxiety is high. And maybe 2 months into quarantining, a violent incident occurs. And all of a sudden, those children are exposed to something they had never been exposed to before. That is called rekindled trauma. Other things can be symptoms that have lied dormant that have never been manifest, including this. Some parents and caregivers, for instance, who have lived complex childhoods. We've got a name for it now. We call it adverse childhood experiences, as we actually assess individuals and the impact that their childhoods may have had on their functioning, who may have come from a family background where they were not, because of particular dynamics that happened in their home. Maybe they were exposed to abuse, some of you on this call. Maybe plain and simple, you were confined because of illness. And all of a sudden, the pandemic has drawn old symptoms out that you never imagined would resurface. And if you don't mind, for any of my Indigenous friends and families that are on this call, some of the greatest experiences in my career have been working with Indigenous communities, one of which I will be on tomorrow, Zooming. And you know, the pandemic has drawn interesting symptoms out for many people from that community. Why? Because quarantining, being separated from families and others, has felt to many like residential schools. And that it's amazing how many folks have shared with me how they were not anticipating that this would draw these things out. The point, though, is this, is that during the quarantining phase, anxieties were high, symptom development was high, and some folks thought they were going crazy. When I came along, and this is what I said to all my friends and colleagues and all the parents and caregivers that I've communicated with throughout this particular 6 months, is I got a standard, another little jingle for you, which is everybody deserves a good meltdown every now and then. By the way, what do you think of that one? Because there's all kinds of parents being crushed under the weight, thinking they're supposed to be serenely perfect through this pandemic. There's professionals thinking it too, but who, by the way, we're all just real human beings also. And as I've told folks that, I said it's unreasonable to be serene. That in actuality, you're supposed to have this thing built because the pandemic sucks. And that in actuality, so does quarantining and all of those issues. Well, when we take it back though, here's become the problem, is that during quarantine with heightened anxiety also comes the fact that sometimes relationships became impaired, and now adults are struggling with how to even talk to each other because we've gotten a little sick of each other. By the way, the kids were, some of them, anxious to go to school meaning they wanted to be there, not realizing that part of it had to do with this impaired closeness-distance cycle. But we know that one of the standards around suicide prevention is that the suicide is the tragic outcome. But the reason for suicides, folks, 10 people can engage in the same act of violence, but for 10 different reasons. It's a standard we learned years ago, and it's helped us so much in our violence prevention. But by the way, 10 people can die by suicide, but for 10 different reasons also. Seriously, what do you think of that? Because if we're just focusing on the outcome only, then it doesn't allow us to get in there to address the issues of how this person in your circle or my circle may be moving on that pathway. So then how do we actually identify? How do we intervene? We have to create a context that actually allows openness to exist inside of our families, inside of our professional organizations, by the way, the community between parents and staff at schools and others. And although I'm talking about kids, I am really emphasizing an adult dynamic of how we interact with each other also, and here's why. In human systems, we call it a parallel process. A parallel process means whether you like it or not, whatever the anxieties are at the adult level, whatever is going on, what the parents and caregivers are talking about. As a family therapist, I've had many parents over the years tell me that their kids don't know that we're struggling as a married couple, for instance, or that the kids are unaware that this has happened or that has happened. And I want you to know that it's exceedingly rare that the kids have not picked up that there is stress amongst the adults. Well, the parallel process is that whatever the dynamics are amongst us and the adults will trickle down to the kids. If we are hopeful that we can be connected with each other and we can solve these things, that we can reach out, if you will, to our children and each other, then the kids will be hopeful also. If we're not, then the kids will feel it as well. I promise you that having done this work for 20 plus years, every time we have slowed down and stopped these things is because the adults came together first. Well, then it takes us to a couple of issues. One is high profile, if you will, trauma. That includes both all of the focus, if you will, and the knowledge and insight and some misconceptions about the suicides in this region. And it also comes from the high profile coverage of the pandemic. In all honesty, no matter which political stripe you are, even the US political climate has stressed out the world. And so when you look at COVID-19 also that's out of control, we say this about trauma. The trauma in and of itself, especially high profile trauma, does not generally just create new symptoms out of nothing. Instead, trauma tends to just intensify already existing symptoms in human systems. What that actually means is that trauma exposes my weaknesses as an individual, or that if my marriage and my family has been kind of a closed, we haven't been open with each other about how we're really thinking, feeling, and doing, and if we've lived that way for the past 5 years, then a tragedy is not going to make our family more functional. Instead, it is going to intensify already existing dynamics. Well, we're seeing that in society, including south of the border, with the George Floyd tragedy. Folks, George Floyd did not cause that tragedy, all of the ongoing civil unrest that followed. Instead, that tragedy just intensified already existing symptoms in America. And by the way, we're not free of systemic racism in Canada either. But I share the issue of high profile because would you agree that media coverage of trauma can intensify the trauma response? It can intensify the symptoms. And especially if it's not reported on strategically and usefully. Oh no, without a doubt. Media also has been used for good. I gladly and willingly did 3 interviews today with local media in relation to what we're doing tonight. But the reality is that the human organism only has so much emotional energy that we can expend in a single day. And one of the problems is this, is that too many of us, and I mean it, are spending our energy on watching the news. And I'm talking the national news, the international news. We're filling ourselves with the pandemic, along with filling ourselves, if you will, about all of the tragedies that have occurred around us. And here's the problem. If we only have so much emotional energy to expend in a single day, some people are expending their energy in the first hour that they wake up in the morning with that friggin' TV going nonstop, on the iPhones nonstop, so that we don't have enough emotional energy to actually sometimes realize that those around us are struggling. In La Ronge, Saskatchewan, we had a series of suicides occur a couple of years ago. It made national news. And then beyond La Ronge were several other individuals, and there were broad age ranges, but in this particular early cluster were 11, 12, 13-year-old kids. And one of the things that happened in the aftermath was a colleague of mine who was a children's advocate for the province, Corio Soup. Him and his colleagues and I sat down and talked about kind of interviewing young people. And then they went to the north and they interviewed a lot of kids to try to understand why so much depression, suicidality, etc. And what they came up with was a number of themes, but two relevant to our purposes here. The first one was that the kids said openly that our parents, our grandparents, our caregivers need to believe us when we tell them we're hurting. And so we came up with another jingle years ago. It related to violence first and then suicide. That is, one of the biggest problems we deal with is underreaction to blatant indicators that someone is moving on a pathway to suicide. That we want to be so inclined to think that they're just talking, they're just beaking off, that they don't really mean it. But in this particular climate, folks don't roll the dice. It's called better safe than sorry. And the reality is that many people do give conscious or unconscious cries for help. What we need is, of course, clarity around, if you're concerned, then who do you call? Who do you talk to? And again, you'll hear more about that as we go through this evening. But it speaks to this issue that we have children out there, adults out there, who felt that they have maybe asked for help or have tried to ask for help and just weren't heard. Well, we say that if somebody gives a cry for help, but we, the professionals, heaven forbid, fail to respond, then what will our failure to respond inadvertently do to their level of risk? And the answer is it will increase it. But I've also met with a lot of parents and caregivers over the years, including grandparents and others, who come and talk to me about their child, their grandchild, their partner. And they'll say, I think they're just doing it for attention. And my line has been, better safe than sorry. Let's treat it seriously, and then we'll determine otherwise. But the second theme that came out of the project that my colleagues in Saskatchewan did was something that I wasn't anticipating. And that one was, and the kids said, and our parents and caregivers need to get off their iPhones. Well, I thought that was really interesting because I, like other colleagues, have been talking about the kids getting off their iPhones for several years now, and that's part of the problem. Lo and behold, I wasn't paying attention to the fact that the adults are filling themselves with enough of this stuff also, that we're draining our emotional energies. And so I'm not saying you got to get rid of the iPhones forever, but I'm here to tell you, you got to limit how much you're using that stuff so that you can be present for the kids also and for each other. Well then, here is a standard. So one of the most powerful interventions that we have done in every single community, me and my colleagues elsewhere, me and my colleagues here also, has been to ignite in all of you parents and caregivers the desire to have meaningful conversations with your children. And I'm talking to you now very much as a trained family therapist also. A meaningful conversation isn't just that my kid knows I love them, they got a roof over their head and I say, I love you at night. On the contrary, our kids are actually very much waiting, if you will, for the adults to make sure that we're present. Oh, by the way, don't Benny, you got to get too defensive as I'm talking here. Lots of parents are having great conversations with their kids, but some think they are. And I'm here to tell you, we can do a better job of it, all of us. And so a meaningful conversation isn't just that we're in proximity where we say, I love you, that in actuality, our kids have already heard us talking about our attitudes towards depression, towards suicide, towards any other issues that might be ailing a child. For instance, we know amongst young people in suicide that members of the LGBTQ community would be higher risk, by the way, to enter into that. Why? Because they know the attitudes, beliefs, and perspectives of their families of origin. And if they've already heard a negative comments, if you will, then why would they dare risk coming forward? When I take it back to just those struggling maybe with depression, suicidality because of a variety of reasons, if there's a parent or caregiver listening who knows that you've had a perspective in the past, which has actually been, if you will, that folks just need to suck it up and move on, anybody can work their way through with a little bit of willpower, I want you to reconsider that. If you're thinking, maybe I have a child who actually does seem like they've been a little off, who seems like they've been kind of lower energy. Maybe I've sent them the message that I don't want to hear them say anything about depression, when in actuality, they need to know you're prepared to receive it. Meaningful conversations are where we create opportunities and contexts to actually share how we think and feel about something, and then ask our kids also. One of the best ways to do it, 21 years ago, 21 plus, almost getting to 22 this April, hard to believe. But when the Columbine and then the Tabor school shooting occurred, we likewise held a large parent meeting, and my role was to lead the crisis response years ago in that tragedy. And when we pulled all the parents and caregivers, it was amazing how many at the 1 year anniversary said, do you know what? If our kids want to talk to us, they know that we're here, that we're prepared to talk. And I said, no way. Some kids will come by nature and talk to parents and caregivers, but others need to be invited, and they need to know that we're prepared to receive it. Well then, with that, I told them, and my counsel is the same to you tonight, as I said, if you're wondering what the in should be, go home and say to your kids, I just spent 2 hours at W.R. Myers High School listening to some of the different experiences the kids are having and what some of the adults are having with you guys. And I think that I maybe underreacted to what it was like for you folks to live in the aftermath of a school shooting. Likewise, I wonder what it's been like for you to live in the aftermath of a suicide, etc. And by being open and demonstrating it, I promise you, our kids, if they sense genuineness, and it is the greatest ace up the sleeve we all have, if they sense that you're being genuine and want to know, and that you're maybe learning some things, then those kids will talk. But there is actually a standard, and I'll use it with what I used in Myers years ago, and I've used ever since. Is I had quite a few men, so I am going to talk to the men, by the way. And sometimes I wish I was a great big strapping jock, if you will, so that I could really talk from that perspective. But instead, I'm a skinny 145-pounder, although I am ripped underneath. And plain and simple, a father to a father is what I did in Tabor all those years ago. Because I had a couple of men who actually were angry that we were having a meeting similar to this one here. And these fathers were talking about, this is you counselors trying to keep this stuff alive. People have moved past this, etc. And so I was left to have to duke it out very early on in that particular parent meeting. And as I duked it out, I had a father who actually interrupted this one man who was taking me on. And he said to the father, and he knew him, we all knew each other, by the way. And he said, I hear what you're saying, because I was kind of wondering, why are we talking about this now? We haven't had another shooting, or we haven't had another suicide. Why are we talking about this now? And then, though, that second father, he said, I kind of felt the way you felt when we first came in. But then he talked about walking by the spot in the high school where the shooting occurred. And he said that when I walked by it, I was shocked when all of a sudden tears welled up inside my eyes. And I realized, oh my goodness, I thought that actually this thing was past. And here I was bearing the symptoms. And the father in front of all those parents, who was a well-respected former athlete in the community, etc. And he said, I realized that I have not been paying attention to how my kids are doing in this school, because I haven't been anywhere around this school since the shooting occurred. And now I'm realizing that my kids have been exposed to this site every day, and I've never shown an interest. And so as we talked, this was my counsel. I said, what I want you to do, as they said, what should we do? What should we say? I said, we know your kids are struggling because many kids have disclosed in the aftermath of that shooting that they were depressed and suicidal. So forget the violence piece to what we're dealing with here. They were depressed, suicidal, but they didn't feel they could open up to some of the parents and caregivers. And so I said, that's why we're actually holding the particular meeting. And by the way, even some of the helping professionals were underreacting to how serious things had become. And so my comment was this. I said, you fathers in particular, and obviously mums and others, but I said, I want you fathers to go home and model openness with your boys. Because if you realize you haven't had a meaningful conversation with your boys in 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, or never, now's the time to do it. And I said, and I want you to go home and I want you to tell them the truth about how you felt tonight here with all of us parents together and professionals, who most of us are parents also. And I said, when you tell them, I want you to basically man up and apologize and say, I think I might have underreacted to just what it was like to be in that school. And if you felt some intense emotion, share it. Model that men can be open in this regard also. And I said, then tell them that it's time to transition and say to your children, so I want to repair that now. How are you doing? And I counsel every parent to strategically say, and how are your friends doing? That is a strategic form of interviewing our children, and here's why. Some kids aren't prepared to talk about themselves, agreed? But if we throw in, and how are your friends doing? They might say, I'm fine, but actually I am worried about this one. And it's how us adults come together and form a powerful, connected team that says, okay, if I'm concerned, I'm going to share this. But I also said to the fathers that you need to know that when all of a sudden you start to have a touchy-feely conversation with your boys, that you are going to creep some of them out. What do you think of that? That in the end, if a father hasn't had a meaningful conversation, all of a sudden you are now, you're not supposed to expect a Hollywood miracle like two people running slow motion on the field, getting ready to embrace and have a wonderful moment. You're going to creep some of them out. But here's the rub. After you deliver the genuine message that you care, that you're prepared to talk, if they want to talk, that you will, they may blow you off, and don't push it. Don't elevate the anxiety unnecessary, because the higher the anxiety, the greater the symptom development. Instead, after you deliver the message, then you leave it. And I told those fathers that on day number 2, that's when the rub is going to come. That's when the little miracle will occur. I said, you get up in the morning, your boys will be thinking, oh crap, I hope they're not going to talk to me about this again. Don't. Let them think that it's a done and over kind of moment of weakness. You go to work, and then when you come back from work and you've had supper and things have settled down, now is when I want you to close the deal. And I told those fathers that you then go to your sons one-on-one and you say, son, I want you to know that what I brought up yesterday, I mean it. I wished I had talked to you earlier. I do care about you. I care about your friends, etc. How are you doing? And I said, I'm going to tell you something, that even if they are struggling, but they're not prepared to tell you yet today, 2 days later, then they'll tell you on the 3rd or the 4th, once they realize you're genuinely committed to hearing it. And plain and simple, if not, then you'll still get a genuine interest that you cared enough to do it. What followed in the aftermath of that incident, and then many others since, is that those kids, the most calls that we got in the the follow-up to that meeting was, yes, referrals increased, but we had a ton of parents tearfully calling us to say thank you, because they had had one of the most meaningful conversations they had had in years. I know folks are looking for a rocket scientist intervention, but I'm here to tell you the most powerful intervention is that we first of all begin to talk with our kids, but only after us adults are congruent with each other that we need to do so. If you can come together in that fashion as a community, we'll identify so many things, including what's about to occur as I wrap up, which is the many, many things that have been shared by parents and caregivers in terms of themes that you're seeing. So I want to leave one last comment for now, and then I'll join my colleagues in the question and answer also. That is that there is no way of overcoming profound loss and trauma when they occur without hope. And that we have the research to actually confirm it, that unless the human organism has some level of hope that we can do this, we'll never be able to get through these things. So a little jingle I learned in family therapy years ago is simplistic and powerful. Two people can absorb more anxiety than one person can on their own, which means that a parent, even a single parent who has, if you will, a connected other adult that they can feel supported by, vent to from time to time, etc., the two of us can absorb more anxiety and therefore be present for each other and our kids than one person can on their own. Likewise, 3 adults can bear more anxiety than just 2. Then how much more so by activating an entire parent community, an adult community, to help us assess what the kids are saying, what the adults are saying, what is needed, and then to be able to fine-tune the interventions beyond just what we're going to do tonight. And so that's why we call this step number 1, to get to this part here, and then we'll see what we need after that. Bless your hearts.
Thanks, Kevin. Next up, we'd like to welcome division psychologists Greg Goddard and Claire Peterson.
Thank you, Kevin. 2 people absorbing some anxiety. It's nice that we're talking together. Thanks for doing. Thank you for your focus on genuineness, on family open conversations. I'm grateful.
So, I think Greg and I are both so grateful to be here with you tonight and to be in your living rooms and your kitchens. And we're thankful that you trusted us to ask some really powerful questions. We know we're not going to be able to answer all of your questions tonight, and we want to keep those lines of communication open. But we're hopeful that we'll address many of them. We've been able to sort of narrow them down to some key themes that came up over and over and over. So you might hear your specific question, or you might hear themes that are related to your question. But if you feel at the end that your questions haven't been answered, continue to submit them. We've provided you with contact information for supports in your child's school as well. Reach out. We have family school liaison workers and school liaison counselors available following this session that can also answer some questions, get you connected with resources, or put you in touch with somebody. So please continue to reach out. So I think if we're ready to dive into some questions, Greg? Okay.
Thank you, by the way, for your vulnerable and courageous questions. It was lovely as Claire and I had sort of begun to develop a beautifully well-crafted speech, and we tossed it because your questions are framing for us what I think we need to address.
Yeah, absolutely. They were really powerful, and so it was great for us to be able to look at them together and say, okay, let's just answer what they're asking us. And so I'm hopeful that this conversation is meaningful for you and feels as good as it does for Greg and I. So the first issue that came up over and over was talking just about the pandemic, which Kevin has alluded to already, and talking about how the return to school has been challenging, kids feeling disconnected, really just hearing from parents that it's been hard to go back to school. It was hard to leave school. And so, we've faced some unusual challenges as a community over the past 6 to 9 months. We've lost some routines. We've lost a sense of predictability, even just our favorite activities. And so I think as a community, we've had a sense of disconnection or feeling isolated. And we know that when we're feeling isolated, how we become resilient and how we cope is through connection and relationships. And the pandemic has made that more challenging to have really authentic and meaningful connection with each other. But we know that we continue to seek it out. And so re-entry to school has posed another set of challenges for some of our families. And I think that you'll find some of you are having very different emotions about the return to school. Some of you may be feeling happy and relieved. Some may be feeling worried about their children going back to school, or even a sense of loss. I'm a parent as well. I have a 6-year-old and an almost 10-year-old, and I know that the return to school felt different this year. If you've got a student who's graduating or starting kindergarten, This year doesn't look like the way it was supposed to, and last year didn't end the way it was supposed to. And I think we need to acknowledge those feelings, that that's really challenging for us and that we feel disappointment about that. But I think it's also important to remember that as adults, we set the tone for our children. You know, I've had to work around my own feelings about that and think about what messaging I'm sharing with my kids and what they're taking away from that, focusing on the positives. Our kids are always listening to us, and it's easy for them to pick up on cues from us, from their peers, from the media about how they should feel about that. So I think when we have an opportunity, we can focus on hope and resilience, focusing on what we can control versus what we can't. We can't control the province's plan for return to school. We can't control the rules, but we can control how we go into those situations and what our attitudes are. We want to focus on using positive language, ask our kids questions about what's going well about school. There's been some positives that have come out of this as well. So what's happening for you that you enjoy, that's going well? And acknowledging and validating their feelings. This year is different. It feels different. I think Kevin used language, it sucks. It does. And it does for staff as well. It's okay to have those feelings and validate them. We just don't want to get stuck there. You know, and I don't think we want to not assume that the experience is negative for all of our students. School staff are sharing the same thing. They're working harder than ever to balance connection and curriculum. And so it's okay if you're a classroom teacher and you're joining us today, it's okay to validate those feelings in your classroom and say to your students, this feels different. How can we stay more connected? What can I do in this classroom? What could we do to make this feel normal, particularly for our online students? That came through as well in the questions. Know that each school is working on ways to safely bring back those meaningful opportunities for connection during the day, the clubs and activities, things that our kids really look forward to. We're trying to find ways to bring those back in a really responsible way. The follow-up to that was really just how do I talk to my kids about mental health in general? And I think the first step to that is really just being vulnerable. Talking with our kids about mental health is hard. Many of us grew up in families where that was not common. But I think, as Kevin alluded to earlier, when we put that conversation on the table, we're saying it's open for discussion and we're making it okay to talk about it. It takes the pressure off our kids, particularly our teens, to have to come to us and bring it up. So get it on the table. I think we have to watch our language. The language we use is important. Our culture has a tendency to pathologize feelings. So we're not talking about worry and sadness. We're talking about anxiety and depression. Those are very real things that have to be talked about, but just helping our kids start to label their feelings, maybe by labeling our own. If we're not sure what our own feelings are, we don't know where to start, there are tons of resources online. Look up a feelings chart and go through it and think, yeah, that's me. I'm feeling frustrated or sad or angry or happy, excited, and start to use that language in your homes. Being open and non-judgmental, we really want them to bring the messy stuff to us. We know they're going to their peers with that information, but we want them to come to us. But we have to make it a safe place for them to bring that without shame or judgment or criticism. And then thinking about reframing our questions. Instead of saying, how was your day? How are you? Or what did you learn today? You know, my kids' answer to that is always, I don't know. Thinking about more creative questions. What are you looking forward to tomorrow? What was the toughest part of your day today? What's something I could help you with? What's something you wish others understood? Start to call attention to the behaviors they're seeing. You seem quiet, tired, sad, angry. You fill in the blank. They'll correct you if you're wrong. And then I would finish with, consider the time of day for those conversations. Kevin really talked about the importance of meaningful conversations with our kids, and it's not just a one-time thing. Bedtime is when things come up in my house, and I'm sure it's coming up in other people's houses as well. That's often not the best time for us to talk about the things that are really deep, right? So it's making space for those intentional conversations, finding time around the dinner table, taking a walk afterwards, but being really intentional. Bedtime's a better time, I think, to focus on strength, resiliency, and positivity. Greg, did you want to add anything?
Well, yeah, thank you. A couple of the questions that came to us about how to talk to your teens were, how do I get my teen to talk? It's either dead silence or sort of an explosion. How do I sort of pull words from them? And the question implies cajoling or coercing. How do I sort of pull some words from my kid, and I don't think that might have been the intention of the questions, but my feeling is it's more important not that we are either giving information, which would be sermonizing or lecturing our kids, nor extracting information, which would be sort of like interrogating, but that you're just opening a conversation, that you're saying, we can talk about this. I am a person who can engage with you. I'm a safe person who can engage with you as my teen on difficult topics. So I'd be hesitant to give pointers on how to manipulate a conversation to make your kids talk. First of all, because teens are extremely adept at picking out when we're trying to manipulate them. They'll have a radar out for them, so it's just not going to work. But if we can hold a posture of non-judgmentalism, and everyone's been using that word today, and it's super important, that when your kid says something that kind of shocks you or scares you, that you're able to sort of listen with a sense of, I'm not going to judge you and say, why have you taken so long to come to me until now? I'm not going to shame them for bringing up conversations that are a little bit offensive or scary to me, but I'm just going to listen. I'm going to have to sort of practice what's called a thoughtful nod, or the something like, okay, I need to process that, or thank you for being honest. This is hard for me to hear, but I appreciate you trusting me with that. These kind of comments that'll just help our kids feel like, whoa, Dad didn't freak out. It's an idea that I'm a safe person. So being intentional is exactly as I said, being intentional about setting up a time to say, we're going to talk. Hey, Jude, I'm sorry about this because I think it may be a bit annoying to you because I've been asking you every day in September, but I need to sit down with you for about 10 to 20 minutes this evening to talk about your life, about how things are going for you. When's a good time for you this evening for us to sit down and talk? Setting out that time and then saying, as your parent, I love you and I care about you, and I need to know you're safe. And I recognize that this conversation is a little bit off-putting, maybe a little annoying to you, but I'm checking in.
A strategy, if you will, and it's a family dynamic strategy that kind of, there's the foundation, but sometimes you do have to actually be thoughtful. And one of the things that I often say is, even as adults, have you ever had somebody ask you how you're doing? And you say, fine. And by the way, you say fine, even if you're not doing well, because you don't want to actually tell that person. Meaning that sometimes, like it or not, and I don't think any parent, especially if an adolescent, will be shocked by this one, but sometimes you are actually not the right person. Meaning for this particular topic, whatever it may be, that you saying, how are you doing, that a child will blow us off. But here becomes the strategy. I laid the foundation for it early on. I said, 2 people can absorb more anxiety than just one. Well, there are times, even my wife and I, where it was quite evident I was the wrong person to have the conversation, she was the right one. There were other times where in actuality, it was me, not her. But it gets better, folks. I've been in southern Alberta long enough to know the dynamics, even of these multi-generational farming families and other things that we have, because my wife and I, we lived on her father's farm for a little bit. And I always like to joke that me and the dirt don't go together. My hands are softer than my wife's, for crying out loud. But there we were in the friggin' farm anyways. And my kids love grandpa, love grandma, but I'm here to tell you that we used our extended family all the time. To have grandpa, I have a career that put me on the road. Sometimes I would have my father-in-law step in and say, Brian, I need you to do me a favor. Can you go talk to Mitch? And he just saddles in and has a conversation, because 3 of us can bear more anxiety than just 2. Likewise, though, I'll give a secret. And so any of the kids that are listening, plain and simple, take it however you want, but you should actually like to hear what I'm saying also. In my own family, on my wife's side, she has 4 other siblings, and there's one sibling that my kids, if I said, who's your favorite aunt or uncle, they'd say this one particular aunt. And by the way, she can extract truth from them like you wouldn't believe. They'll tell her everything. And when our kids have had difficult times where we just weren't able to crack them, because even Kevin Cameron, a clinician, recognizes sometimes I'm the wrong person to start the conversation. Then Carrie, she gives up that sister of hers a call, says, I need a favor. Can you FaceTime so-and-so? And just kind of tease out what's going on. And that aunt, she makes the call. She's never betrayed the confidence of our kids ever, but she makes the call, and when she sees what's going on, she says, you know what, you need to talk to your mother, you need to talk to your father. And then lo and behold, we always then have our kids, even in adulthood, they come forward. Why? Because they needed one intermediary to put it off of and to build the confidence. Folks, we can be using this, we can be using an older sibling who's off to college or university or wherever they may be, COVID times, but we can work miracles. Also, just very quickly, I want to say in relation to COVID and coming back and to build on what you were saying as well with the first question, is that 10 kids can have anxiety about returning to school during the pandemic, but for 10 different reasons. I hope you guys are getting the theme here. Same behavior, I'm anxious about going to school, but 10 different reasons for it. One may be because of fear of contracting the virus. One may be because they're afraid of giving it to somebody, knowing that kids may be healthy but could carry. A compassionate child who's worried about that. One who, by the way, is worried about taking it home. But how about this? What about a child who maybe their school experience has been so negative, i.e. that they have been bullied, targeted by a peer group, whatever it may be? And for that particular child, they may think even in their own mind that it's the pandemic, but actually it's just returning to school, period. But it's easier to explain it because of the pandemic. And also I'll tell you this, it's called introverts versus extroverts. I actually live an extroverted life, but I'm an extreme introvert, pathological. I always like to say when I'm in a professional realm like this, put me in front of a mic and I can go for it. But once the professional hat's off, it's all weird after that. I'm all introvert. My wife, she's the extrovert. And I'm here to tell you that quarantining in the pandemic was harder on her than on me. Because as an introvert, I was perfectly fine, saddled up in our house and in the office. By the way, you do realize, don't you, that there's some kids who are extreme introverts who didn't want to go back to school because they have to reaccommodate to that social setting that they've just had a 5-6 month break from. So 10 people can engage in the same behavior, but for 10 different reasons. If you treat the big things big and the little things little, some of our anxious children are anxious adults as well. My school colleagues might cringe, so look closely at their faces when I'm talking right now to see how they respond. But I've said if ever there's a time that a child should be able to have a break to get their iPhone and to have a conversation with grandma, who's the one person that stabilizes them, it should be during a worldwide pandemic. That we can get out of the box and be creative also and have more connections with our kids. All right, I'm done.
Another subset of questions that you asked were around how do I know if my child's struggles are sufficiently large enough, concerning enough to warrant the need for more help? Some of the questions were something like, in light of the recent suicides, I feel compelled to take every emotion or struggle my children have seriously and make sure it isn't masking a deeper issue, or that it isn't a sign or symptom of depression. How do I know when my kids' emotions are normal, expected reactions, and when they might need more help? Kevin didn't see these questions earlier, but one is, what if my kid says, I'm fine, every time I ask, and that's all they say? So a couple of comments around that line. If your kid says, I'm fine, and all the other signs that you would be looking for indicating they're legitimately fine, there's a chance that they might be fine. There's a chance that things are actually going all right for them, and I would say a good chance. But even a kid who is fine should feel there's an open conversation they can have with you as a parent for those days that they're not. And then there's going to be kids who say they're fine, but you see in their moods, or you see in their grades, or their friendship circles that they're not fine. Then it's time to maybe step around that first blockade and have a sit down. And with compassion, something like, okay, you're telling me you're fine, and you don't want me to keep asking you these questions. But I'm also seeing you throw your backpack against the wall when you come in the house, and you're very quiet at the supper table, and it just doesn't seem to me like you really are fine. And as your parent, I care about you, and I'm sorry that I'm badgering you a bit about your mood, but I need to check in and know you're safe, that you're okay, that you have the support you need to get through the harder days. Teenagers, Kevin is referring to the distance close cycle, closeness distance. Those of you who've taken Circle of Security or Connect training will recognize the Circle of Security, the attachment cycle. The idea that between parents and teens, there's a bit of a dance that occurs where every conversation you try to open up with your kid, even mundane ones, can push away your teenagers. And teenagers are learning and trying on independence and identity apart from you as parents, a healthy independence. And I would suggest as parents, if you can, try to bear their, what feels to you possibly like rejection without being hurt by it, and continue to show your openness to them. How do you know when your kids' difficulties and emotions are a miserable and yet tolerable part of their lives, or when they've crossed that threshold of needing outside support? The answer, of course, is there's not really a threshold, not a place that every kid you can say once they've crossed it. Universally, we know they need extra help. But what you're looking for is that your teen has the internal and the external resources to be able to get through difficulty. Internal meaning like resilience, we'll talk more about this in a little bit, strengths that they bring to bear, to face adversity. External resources are, who are they connected with? Are they connected to you, to other healthy adults? Is their peer group a consistent and at least somewhat reliable group of kids? If you're concerned about their safety, like if you're seeing depressive behaviors, not getting out of bed for extended periods, illegal behaviors, drug use, self-harm, then it's probably time to seek professional help. Keep in touch with their doctor, pediatrician. Sometimes we just don't know. And I would suggest, if in doubt and you're concerned, call a mental health professional. Well, again, we'll talk more about how to do that. Suicidal comments. It's actually not uncommon for children of almost all ages to make reference to wonder about what it would be like to die, especially in a rage. Very young children, 3, 4 years old, in a meltdown, it's not uncommon for them to say, I wish I was dead. I wish I could just die. It's very distressing often for parents to hear that kind of thing, but I want to urge you that it's not super uncommon. Or for a teen to say, I hate my life. I wish I was dead. FML. However, I think in Nova Scotia, that's frig my life or something. If a kid or teen is talking about suicide, if they're talking about a plan, if they're thinking about hurting themselves or killing themselves, you have to take it seriously. Have that purposeful conversation without trying to do a suicide assessment. Even those of us who are trained in suicide assessment probably cannot have the objectivity to do it with our own children. So you need to connect with a professional. Something like with your kid, you mentioned today that you sometimes wish you were dead. That scares me a bit, and I feel sad to hear it, and I want to make sure you're safe, and we're going to connect you with somebody. Again, talk openly without fear or judgment.
This is the danger of letting psychologists and therapists down. So we're essentially holding all of these people here hostage. We are never going to be done on time, but your questions are too good for us to leave that. So these people can't really leave the room until 1. So I think we just go for it. So hopefully you'll stick with us if we go past the 8:30 time slot. So the next group of questions is really, what are schools doing? What's happening in schools? What are we talking with kids about? What resources are there for staff? Lots of great questions around that. So I think first we need to acknowledge how incredibly hard our school staff are working right now to support our students and families. We've always had a continuum of supports available for our students and families, everything from universal programming, so you might hear that being called capacity building projects, success coaches, a hug program, My Place. That's really, it's for everybody. Those staff are in hallways and classrooms talking to our students about wellness, coping strategies, resiliency. That's happening all the time. We've also got fantastic guidance counselors in our middle schools and high schools, and our family school liaison workers or school liaison counselors, depending on your division, that are working with targeted groups and individuals about more specific issues. And let's not forget our teachers. They're the first point of contact for our kids, and while we don't expect them to be mental health experts, they're in a position to positively connect with kids every day, and they play an important role on our team. If you're not familiar with the supports and who the mental health team is in your school, reach out and ask, what services do we have in our building? Who are those people? Information and contact numbers should have been provided to you in an email, or will come out after this as well if you don't know who those people are. But even though those supports have always been there, I think the pandemic really teed us up to focus, or primed us to focus on mental health and social emotional learning as we came into this school year. We want to be more intentional than ever, and we want to keep these conversations at the forefront. So our staff have already been busy getting into classrooms to talk about mental health, wellness, resources, and supports. We want to make sure that our staff have the information they need to embed these important topics into their classrooms, so it becomes the norm and not a one-off presentation or only covered in one class. We're providing resources, so some of us are using mental health online resources for educators. Staff may want to watch for what Canadian Mental Health Association will be putting on as far as training and PD for suicide prevention and intervention. As far as conversations specifically about suicide, that was asked frequently in the questions. Are we talking specifically about it? Greg might share a little bit more information later on about how to start those conversations with your own children. But our goal in school is really to focus on hope, resiliency, and positive coping. We know it's important to address difficult topics like suicide, and we've been having these conversations with students and families as needed. But we also feel it's important to talk about this within the broader context of mental health, because we want to avoid amping things up or focusing so heavily on loss, grief, and suicide in our larger school communities in a school-wide way. We want to be intentional in our language. We want to make sure that what we're working on is reducing anxiety and not contributing to fear or contagion. Kevin used that language earlier. So counselors are prepared and trained to have those conversations, and we're working with staff to make sure that they know how to get students to the right place. Many of us would have used World Suicide Prevention Day as a platform or opportunity to share information with you, but our efforts have intentionally been placed on resiliency, coping, and knowing who to reach out to. A couple of more specific questions is somebody shared, it's extremely difficult to reach out at school. Teachers don't have time where we can go up to them and say, we need to talk to somebody. How do we make reaching out easier? I know it feels hard to reach out at school, and COVID has made it more difficult to just drop in for supports. But I'm confident we can find ways to get students where they need to be. So if you're reaching out, to have a look at those lists of numbers of who our actual school supports are. We want them to be visible, and we want you to feel like every door is the right door, and there's multiple pathways to care. I'd love to share this feedback with our schools because I know they're working on ways to ensure students have easy access to supports, whether you can email, phone, text, sign-up sheets to make sure that you're seen and that you get to the place that you need to be. And another question was, how do I talk to my child's teacher to make sure we get supports but keep our situation confidential? Our staff are amazing, and if we go back to those numbers and those contacts, you can reach out to counseling supports directly. They'll work with you to help you understand what information others in your school might need to know to support your child, but they'll help you navigate the process and make sure we protect your privacy. Anything you want to add to that before we go to community? No? Okay. And the next area was community supports. What do we have in the community? How do we call for help? What do the resources look like? How do we make it affordable? I think it's important to talk about the level of provincial meetings that have been happening since the start of September, because I think a lot of people in our community wouldn't be aware of that. So we've had representatives from the minister's office. We've been meeting with police, RCMP, lots of the people you see on the stage today, Alberta Health Services, physicians, the primary care network, representatives from the city, the county, our MLAs, SARC, Canadian Mental Health Association, McMahon, and our school divisions. And we've been having really important conversations on how do we close the gaps? What do we need in our community? Looking at getting, is there funds and ways to get more resources out to people to increase training? AHS opened on weekends to see if there was a need, if it was an accessibility issue. We've been working with crisis lines to make sure that they're aware of the situation in Medicine Hat, so that when we call or text those lines, they're aware of what's going on in our community and can respond appropriately. We've been consulting with experts, and they've been working to develop resources. So I hope that it alleviates some anxiety or stress for you to know that there's been lots happening behind the scenes. We really felt like it was important to come together from a school perspective to just have a conversation with you. And we have the ability to reach out to our parent population to do that. But some of the other questions that came up around accessing support is, do kids have to be exhibiting problems to seek counseling? And I would say, counseling can be used to address issues that come up in our life in difficult seasons if we don't have the skills to handle them on our own, but we can also use it as a checkup or a way to stay mentally healthy. So it's great to be checking in with supportive adults or counselors, just like we would for our physical health. Another comment was kids are afraid to reach out. It doesn't matter how many resources are available. My question to that is, how do we open up the conversation so it doesn't seem so scary? I think part of it is about normalizing the experience and being open about the fact that it's okay to not be okay. I think sometimes kids need to experience counseling or have open conversations with parents who've experienced counseling to see that it can be positive. And this might be an area you could support as an at home by starting conversations. ER came up. ER is where you go to get medical help. Where do you go to get emotional help? That's a great question. If it's an emergency, of course, calling 911 or presenting at the emergency room. 811 is another great number to remember. If you can't remember any other phone number, crisis line, call 811. They will make sure you get connected to the right supports. Yeah.
I believe that the operators or the people answering the phone at 811 have been very clearly informed about the situation around Medicine Hat.
Agreed. Yeah. Yeah. So they'll get you to the right place if you can't remember any other number. Kids Help Phone. You can both call them and they have a crisis text line. And then Canadian Mental Health has a great if you need help poster that has all of those numbers on it. As far as affordable options for people to receive counseling in Medicine Hat, so school-based services are free. If you're a college student, there's counseling here. Alberta Health Services, Community Mental Health and Addictions Office. Medicine Hat Family Service offers a sliding scale. Some of our local doctors' offices have behavioral consultants that offer brief short-term therapy. The Psychologists Association of Alberta has offered through the Disaster Response Network up to 3 free sessions with psychologists if you're a frontline healthcare worker or first responder or significantly impacted by COVID. We need to take advantage of that. SARC, you might have an EAP. There's lots of places that we need to check out to make sure we're using up the resources that we have. Sometimes it's an accessibility issue, but sometimes it's just not knowing what's available to us. There's support groups offered through Canadian Mental Health. Wellness Together Canada is an online resource that's federally funded due to the increase in mental health issues because of COVID. And then of course we've got some great private practice psychologists and social workers in town as well, so make sure you're reaching out. The last thing I want to touch on there, a question that came up was, what happens when you call a helpline and how often can you access them? So I called them yesterday and I texted them last night to see how that went. So I used Kids Help Phone. I got an answer to Kids Help Phone text line in 3 minutes. It is a volunteer who's been trained and they have access to a professional counselor. Their goal is to show empathy and to check for safety. As parents, you can connect kids. If you are watching, you can text them. You can text them just to try it out. You can text them together. They won't turn anyone away. They'll try to empower you and work on safe coping skills. It was really easy to use. They risk assess every texter. And they ask really good questions outright. Are you feeling safe? Do you have any thoughts of suicide? They also have the ability to connect with emergency services if need be, and they'll let you know that they're doing it before they enact that response. When I called the Kids Help Phone, they say the average wait time is about 10 minutes. It was higher than usual last night. It was about 30 minutes. So that's important to know that if you're really feeling in distress, they'll tell you, you're caller number 10 on the line, have a backup plan. Know that you could be texting kids the crisis text line in the meantime. It's trained professional counselors that are answering the phone. They were great. They do have a duty to report as well if you share that you're at risk or someone else is at risk, but you'd need to provide them with your name and your phone number or an address for them to do that. They won't turn you away. They'll ask you to think of one main issue to focus on during the call, but you can call back as many times as you want. And on average, they say they chat with kids for 30 to 60 minutes. So parents, staff, kids, feel free to check those resources out. Do a dry run first so that it doesn't feel so scary to call when you're in the middle of something and you really need help. Yeah.
Thanks, Claire. Kevin, I hope you'll just start talking if you see something up time when you think you should add. Thank you. Another subset of questions that came up, and Claire has alluded to this already, is how do I have an open conversation with my child or teen about suicide? Some of them were asking about 7 to 13, 10 to 12-year-olds, not older than 10, 7 to 9-year-olds. One that came in just this afternoon was under 6. And even the question, how do I talk to my under 6-year-old children about suicide, is a heartbreaking question to read. And yet I want to talk very briefly about some parameters around why we need to even ask these questions. First of all, there's a misconception, a common misconception, that talking about suicide with your kids could plant the idea in their heads, that talking about suicide is possibly a bad idea because what if it makes them think about it? And research tells us that's simply not the case. Talking about suicide with your teenage children will not plant the idea in their heads. After a high-profile suicide, or in situations like what we're in Medicine Hat, where the word suicide is being used, where kids are talking about suicide, you as parents want to be talking to your kids about suicide. Checking in about it shows that you're available to your child or teen, and openly discussing your own emotional responses demonstrates that you can handle the discomfort of these kind of difficult conversations. What age? It depends on your child. It's a developmental question about the developmental maturity of your child, but I would suggest that if they're hearing about it, if they are hearing the word suicide from their peers, from the media, you want to preempt that conversation. You want to talk about it with them confidently, candidly, gently, and openly. Under 6, most children under 6, it's difficult for them, for their brains, to comprehend the finality and permanence of death. So oftentimes concrete facts are what you want to share with children under 6 years old. Daddy has died. I'm sad. I'm going to take care of you. I know you've seen me crying. I'm very sad. If questions are asked, you may need to explain the permanence of death. What comes after this depends on your child's response. At a young age, all the way through teenage years, you can trust your children's questions. They'll ask you questions usually that they're ready for the answers to. But as parents, you want to let the child lead, but you want to keep it simple. You want to keep it factual, not many words, and you don't want to go into details. A very important 3-word response you want to be comfortable saying is, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question, but I can see that it bothers you. Sometimes you'll be able to say, we'll help you find out the answer to that question. Other times you'll say, we're not going to know. The question why is a very common, probably the single most common question that comes up after trauma, after suicide, after tragedy. And it's okay to tell your kids, that's a really hard question. And most of us are asking that question right now, and we may never find the answer. I don't know the answer to your question. That is enough sometimes to give your kids a feeling of safety. 6 to 10, 7 to 10, same thing, but I would encourage you to be straight up. Short, true statements, and once again, trust their questions. If they feel it's safe to ask, they'll ask. And I would say answer their questions truthfully. One of the questions posed to us was, how and at what age do you truthfully explain suicide as the cause of death of a family member to a child? And truthfully is such a key word. We just need to be true, give them the facts, and be honest and be concrete. At 11, sort of the 13, middle school age, you want to be frank, you want to be more to the point. You might want to start with, what have you heard? Or what do you know about? At this age, you're going to want to ask this question. Have you or any of your friends ever thought about suicide? 14 and up. Work hard not to be shocked. You want to be willing to take it seriously every time. One of the questions came up, how do I know if it's for attention? And I would like to urge you to consider changing that word from attention seeking to connection seeking. When a child is asking, when they're bringing it up, even if it is what we would sometimes perceive to be just for extra love and affection and connection and attention, I would say that's something we need to pay a lot of attention to. Make sure you are not responding with shame or judgment, and you want to talk about a plan of action at this age. What will you do if you or your friends ever start thinking about suicide or talk about suicide. You want to ask directly and unambiguously and show that you are not scared to have this conversation. At any age, you want to demonstrate appropriate emotional expression. You want to say, I'm sad, but also remember you continue to be the container. You don't want to fall apart because your kids need to be able to feel like they can come to you and that you're going to be safe. If you think you're going to fall apart, it's probably wise, as Kevin was saying, to find another person to join you or have that conversation with them. Any other thoughts?
That was excellent.
Ooh, I like that thought. Okay, how do I help someone who is not ready for help? Several questions came to us, not only about children, but also about spouses or about friends. What do I do when there's someone who might need assistance who's not willing to get it? Suggestions to persuade a young adult, 19 to 21, to seek mental health help when they're extremely opposed. This is a tricky one, but I will say, there's a psychologist named James Prochaska, I have no idea if I'm saying his name right, from Rhode Island. He has developed a theory of change called, well, I don't know what it's called, stages of change. And the first stage is pre-contemplation. Some people might call this denial. I'm not even prepared to begin to think about changing my behavior. It kind of comes from the field of addictions. A person who's saying, I don't want help, I don't need help, might be in pre-contemplation. I urge you who was asking that question to consider that's a continuum. They're probably not at zero. They're probably not at zero. And if you're willing to have that conversation with them and to say, I think you need some help, it's important that we seek some help, you're probably helping them budge from pre-contemplation to what's called contemplation. They're starting to think about, maybe, I don't know, maybe I need help. They're probably going to say to you, I'm fine, I don't need help, when they're in contemplation. The next stage, preparation. We're now at 3 of 5 stages of change and they still haven't taken a step. So whoever you talk about might be somewhere on that continuum. Finally, we get to action and then maintenance. And I would suggest that it's important that you try to continue to help encourage it. Be aware that you're not always going to convince someone to get help. You can't make someone get help. But one of the things that Prochaska says to do to get people to move from pre-contemplation to contemplation is just to start raising doubts. Raise doubts about the harmlessness of their situation. Evoke concerns that maybe all is not well, and just have those conversations. And I will finally say on that point, sometimes a skilled therapist can meet a person who's not ready, I'll say not ready, with quotes, and simply set the stage for them to experience what it's like to have a safe place. So it might be worth encouraging a connection with a therapist. I know that, again, that might be frustrating if you're asking and you're like, yeah, I've tried. But keep in mind that change is a continuum.
Right. Where they're at right now, they might not be ready for change, but you're opening that door. And what I'm hearing Greg saying is really giving them the feedback that I love you, I care about you, this is important to me, and I'm worried about you. And even if you're only planting that seed, the hope is that they're growing from that.
Add one more thing to that, which is I'm big on consultation. And so one of the benefits of taking advantage of helping professionals and others, or for that matter, just a wise family member or friend that you have, is having a conversation about your particular lot. And one of the things that I don't like about this format, unfortunately, is we can't be together. In other formats we are, and you get to ask the questions and maybe even provide a little detail on that particular issue you guys are talking about. But the reality is that sometimes it's actually when I get called in on a case, is that it is that caring parent or caregiver or that partner who, when I ask them, well, how do you bring up the topic? How do you approach it? That in all honesty, some of it is in the delivery. That the people, again, may actually be prepared to a certain degree to receive some help if it's not presented in a way such as, well, it's clear you got issues, you need to talk to a counselor. That's about a guaranteed way of ticking off just about anybody the minute that we suggest that somebody else needs a counselor. Whereas consulting and having strategies, I'm giving people strategies all the time on both how to get their partner to buy into maybe wanting to come in together. And I'm certainly giving parent strategies all the time in how to rework how you're actually approaching our kids on a particular issue. So one of the things that I really hope for Medicine Hat is that all of the resources that Claire was sharing as well and others, that becomes even more formalized. So it's all in one neat package. And in all honesty, that you move to a real consultation model where you parents and caregivers know that you can actually pick up the phone and that you can have a quick consult. Here with education, which has been my world also, not that I'm an educator, but I've worked with my colleagues across the continent also. We have folks where in the end, sometimes just a 10-15-minute conversation is enough little insight. And then all of a sudden you've got a plan on how you should proceed, including whether or not you're the right person or maybe somebody else steps into the role. You should always be thinking strategically to be helpful.
What you're saying, Kevin, makes me also think that if you're working with a teen or a young adult or an adult who's not ready to get help for themselves, it's okay to get help for you. It's really hard work supporting somebody who's struggling with mental health or addiction. And so if you need to just reach out for you because you've been walking alongside them on that journey and it's frustrating to see them not moving in the direction you'd like, then perhaps the support is really for you to help you walk that journey with them. And that's okay too.
Thank you. We found that another subset of questions that you brought to our attention when you registered for tonight were around grief. How long does the grief process take? Does going back to normal life routine help end grief sooner? What signs do I look for if my child is grieving? My boys don't like to open up about their feelings. What do you recommend for kids like this? What supports are in place for someone under 18 grieving a loss? How can I help my son cope through the stages of grief? And then comments about your own grief. Effect on school staff. How do I, as a teacher, help students while dealing with my own grief and struggles? First, again, thank you for your courage in asking that question. I feel like grief is a very common experience for a lot of people right now. And I want to sort of assert that grief is not universal. Everyone's grief is an individual process. And grief is a good and healthy thing. It's similar to the pain a person feels when they break a limb. Nobody likes pain, but the pain is a part of the healing. And grief, similarly, is a healthy, important thing to go through. But it is wicked. Often in grief work, we'll ask a person to remember when they were really young, when they wandered off from their parent or guardian at Disneyland or West Edmonton Mall or somewhere in a public place, and how feeling lost or abandoned can really trigger panic, fear, anger, frustration, terror. When someone you love dies, it's normal to experience a similar range of feeling. Grief is often hard work. And there are a series of tasks that you have to go through in the process of grief. And I'll quickly talk about them, but then I want to assert that your question is extremely relevant because you're saying, well, all your questions are relevant, forgive me, but you're saying, I want to help carry my students, I want to help carry my kids, and I'm struggling. How do I step around that and be what my kids need? I'd like to try to attend a bit to that too. In grieving someone who you've lost, one of the first tasks you have to do, and it's called the task because it legitimately takes profound effort, is to accept the reality of the loss. Another is to experience your pain. Experiencing pain and not avoiding pain is tricky business. And it's an essential part of moving toward healing. Third, adjusting to the new environment without that person. That is not an easy task. A fourth task is what's called emotionally relocating the loved one, finding how they continue to belong in your life. And then there are several other tasks, including developing a new self-identity, allowing yourself to accept help now and always. How do I carry on if I'm in the middle of grief? For most of us, grief comes in waves. It's often compared to waves because it can be intense, but it can also subside for moments. And one of the testaments I heard from someone who went through some profound grief in his own loss was basically like surfing or getting out. I'm not a surfer, so forgive me, I'm making this up. Getting out far enough to where the waves are perfect to surf, you have to crash through a few waves to get out there. And then when the wave is past you, you have the ability to swim and to do the things that you're trying to do as a teacher, as a parent. And when that wave comes again, the next one, you've got to crash through it. You have to give yourself the compassion you need. You have to recognize it's a difficult moment, bear through the waves, acknowledge your grief, identify your supports and cling to them, and then be ready when the wave subsides to carry on. But also model self-care. Similar to an injury, if you need extra care, you might need to get it. You might need to take some time off. You might need to go out of your way to make sure that you're tending to your needs during those waves. But be aware that grief, in healthy grieving, those waves become often farther apart. Maybe the intensity is similar. Oftentimes it gets less, but they become farther apart. So you will have more capacity to continue your life as you move forward through healing.
That reminds me of something that I've learned in conversations with Kevin as well, is that sometimes the grief process, you would say, is prolonged when things are really amped up in the media. And so we've got a series of incidents in our community that make it hard to go through the natural grieving process. Funerals even look very different for us right now. So some of our typical ways of going about grief have been disrupted. And so I think it's important for us to acknowledge that right now it might feel harder to catch that wave than it might have a year ago. But you know what Greg is saying is so powerful about moving through that in the stages that you're ready, but knowing that it does feel different right now. Share about that, Kevin.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's part of the pandemic as well, as it has interrupted the normal grieving process. And so in other communities that I have worked with also, when there are so many tragedies that occur, because one reminds us of the other, that it can keep, again, a sustained level of risk. That's the reason for this meeting, right? Is just to inoculate folks, to say we got to keep the conversation open and work our little miracles.
Okay, we're getting close, I promise you. Social media was another big question about how is social media impacting our kids? How do we teach them how to use it in a healthy way? What impact is it having? So we know that our kids are using a variety of social media platforms to connect and to really get their buckets filled, using Snapchat, Instagram, TikTok. They're leaving Facebook for us old guys now. They're not using that. So sometimes we're not seeing that the content that they're looking at. Much of the things our kids are looking at are positive and hopeful and really intended to meet that need for connection that we have. But there's also hurtful information, threatening information, and negative content that our youth are sharing amongst themselves. And what we're seeing or hearing is that kids are spending more and more time online and feeling more and more disconnected. So part of that might be the perfect images and videos they're seeing through filters and Instagram. But the flip side of that, I think, is the algorithms that these programs use to auto-generate mean that if I come across somebody on social media that looks like they're feeling as lonely or disconnected as I am, and they're sharing messages that really speak to me, because that's where I'm sitting, when I hover over that video and I watch it, then that pulls in more and more of the same. And so over time, you start to fill yourself with really negative content. And it starts to feel more hopeless. And it's, you know, as Kevin mentioned before, the greater the anxiety, the greater the symptom development. And so they start to look for that instant gratification of likes and shares, people looking at your videos. And that has to be exhausting, looking for that. We need to start talking about that. We need to find better ways for us to get that gratification and to feel that positive feedback from our peer community. We also know there's lots of negative chatter happening on social media. Kids, you know, talking to each other in ways that are really inappropriate. But we also know that there's people from outside our community that sometimes can infiltrate those groups. Our kids don't typically have great privacy settings on their social media accounts. They are happy and welcome to talk to people that they don't know. And so often they may not know the people that they're connecting with. And so we're aware of situations where people from outside our community who are adults are posing as youth and getting in the middle of those conversations and really wreaking a lot of havoc and creating negativity. And so talking about that with our kids is important too. We know that they're turning to each other I think if there's the absence of information, or we haven't had a way to help them make sense of what's going on, they start relying on each other for support. We're starting to hear that our kids are using language like, I'm a counselor for my friends, we're saving each other, I've helped out, 3 friends already this week. We need to help our kids know what the line is. Positive peer mentoring is an excellent strategy. It's a great way. We want our kids connected to positive peer role models, but they also have to know, when do I need to tell an adult? When do I need to get help? When can I talk about my friends? I don't want to keep secrets. So, I think some tips as far as having open conversations about the use of social media, that was the question. As part of that's also modeling it ourselves. It's not about taking away social media. It's not about taking away phones. I think kids are sometimes afraid to talk to us about what they're seeing online because they think we're going to take that brand new iPhone. It's about teaching them how to use it as a tool for communication and not a replacement for human connection. It's not where we should be feeding ourselves from. So setting up times that devices are turned off. We want it to avoid it being the first thing and the last thing they see. That goes for us too. Avoid keeping or charging devices in your bedroom. I know it sounds really simple. You might actually need to buy an alarm clock because if that just makes it a habit that you're going to check, Facebook in the morning, check Snapchat before you go to bed. Have open conversations about the kind of content they're viewing, how comfortable they are, and who they would talk to. Maybe it's not you as a parent. Maybe it is that auntie or a grandparent or a trusted adult that's in their life, a coach, a teacher. Even talking with younger kids about how they might feel something in their body, that heart rate, sweaty palms, that lets them know that something they've seen is uncomfortable and that they probably need to do something about it. For younger kids, even older kids, look at their devices regularly. I know that for lots of us that feels like an invasion of privacy, but I think if we're having open, healthy conversations and we set that up from the start and we establish those practices that in order to keep you safe, I want us to be really open about what you're seeing, what you're sharing. Don't wait until they see something scary. Try to talk about it ahead of time. We really want to get out there in front of it. But if you think they've already seen something scary, and some people shared some examples of, there was recently a video that went viral on TikTok. A lot of kids saw it. It was very disturbing, distressing content. Give them that safe place. Try to remain calm, not be shocked, as hard as that might be. Be non-judgmental and just try to talk as openly and candidly about what they saw, how it made them feel. If you don't feel prepared to have that conversation and you're really struggling with what to say because your own alarm bells are going off and you're feeling emotional about it, reach out to another helping professional and let them help you navigate that conversation. And a tool or support, a bit of a plug that I know I find helpful with my own kids is commonsensemedia.org. It has some great information and explanations on popular sites, but it also looks at movie, TV, online gaming, all of the things that kind of give you an idea of what our kids might be watching. Because if you're like me, you're not really up on all the lingo and all the apps that are out there. So that's another way to kind of check that stuff out.
On that too, on social media, it's interesting. Back in the day, we used to, if a kid came home from school, we'd ask them what happened at school. And I've been telling professionals and parents for several years now, you can ask what happened at school, but most of what's actually occurring that's elevating kids' anxiety has occurred online. So we also need to get good at saying, so what's happened online, or in particular, something going on social media, what's happening right now? And the minute we say to somebody, post something, all of a sudden kids actually with the right question will actually tell us the truth. So we sometimes confine ourselves with the simplicity of, did something happen at school? When in actuality, this is the realm. And by the way, get hip. My mother-in-law, when my kids started getting older, she got onto social media and was on some of their accounts. And by the way, they didn't know how to say no to grandma. So she was actually doing some surveillance for us that we weren't even doing ourselves. So I'm telling you, get hip. Use the larger family system wrapped around you to do some good.
All filling the space with social media and using our phones. And so I don't know how many of you have been in an elevator and was actually able to look at the person next to you and cope with that time. We're sitting in a waiting room somewhere, everybody pulls out their phone to focus on what they're doing. Our kids are doing that right now as well. And because we have an absence right now of some of the normal routines they would fill their time with during their day. They're quickly going to their devices. And so most of their conversations and connections are really happening in that platform. So we want to be up on that.
Thing to add to that one as well, in addressing the social media dynamic and some of the highest risk cases that I worked on, I've encouraged the parents, the step parents, the grandparents, whoever it may be, to also take their turns on firing off a text to that kid that they're worried about, because they got their iPhones with them all the time anyway, so do you. And to fire off the text randomly, it's your job today, for instance, to do it, because you know my boy. And the text is actually firing off a pic of when the two of you were together, maybe gone fishing or doing something. Just say, hey, I was just thinking about you. You know what, you're one of my favorites, you're my favorite grandson. The reality is, we have actually, because of this little strategy, interrupted the pattern from somebody who is in distress or thinking of doing something bad, to be quite frank, and all of a sudden there comes that little communication that draws them out of the connection to what's going on media and social media and brings them back to reality. And these little simplistic things can actually save lives and create a space where all of a sudden a kid or an adult is texting us back, oh, I remember that, etc. And then they're dropping some line or some hint. How are you doing? Do you got time for a conversation? And maybe we've just opened up the door. So there's all kinds of cool little things that we can do to turn the technology to our good.
Heard him, Grandma. Get hip.
That's right.
I like it. Thank you. Okay, ready for our last last subset of questions. If I can tell by that extra large clock, we're almost at the end. How do we build resilience in our kids? And I love that we're ending on this, because really suicide, people who die by suicide have come to a place where they see no other options. They don't feel they can bounce. And resilience is about bounciness. Can I bounce back from adversity? Can I take a hit and get back up? How do we build resilience in our teens and in our children? And I think that's the question. And I don't have an easy answer, but some ways we can. Safe and non-judgmental communication patterns at home. I said the word patterns because it's not a one-time conversation. If you're able to have one of these difficult conversations we've been talking about, you're not done. It needs to be a pattern of open communication. We want to support our kids' positive sense of self. We know that self-efficacy is fragile at times of stress. Kevin and I were talking earlier about how during this pandemic, we have a more thinly stretched deployment of our coping resources. If we are able to help our kids see the things that they're gifted at, that they have strengths in. My wife is a play therapist, and she once showed me a little exercise she does with kids where you put one, trace your hands, and on the fingers of this hand, write the strengths that you feel you have, the gifts that you have to bring to the world. And on the fingers of this hand, write the people that love you and care about you, the adults or the people who can shore you up when you're having a hard time. So we want to celebrate and foster the internal and external resources that our children have. We want to encourage their freedom to question. We don't want to shut down their questions that they ask us, especially around rules or when we say no. They allow them to question it. I'm not saying allow them to change your mind, but allow them to question it. Recognize and label emotions. Claire was talking beautifully earlier about we just want to legitimize and acknowledge how we feel, where we're feeling in our body. Allow them to identify and express their feelings so that they can understand what they're going through. To recognize when I need to take action, to know how to communicate with my support system. We want to teach them how to connect with peers and families, how to listen and empathize. I'm going to add in here, we want to help our children learn how to help others. In grief, in response to trauma, when we've gone through something terrible, one of the best healing mechanisms or strategies you can use is reaching out and helping others. So find an age-appropriate volunteer activity your kids can do, Prairie Gleaners or some sort of organization that you can get your kids to help with, visiting senior citizens' homes, doing something where your kids can feel like they're giving. It builds a sense that I am contributing to the world around me. It's so essential for our kids. Healthy routines. I could go on. I'll really quickly say diet, sleep, and nutrition, the holy trinity of self-care. Make sure your kids are eating well, sleeping well, and exercising. This is essential to resilience. And even when your child is facing very painful events, help them look at the situation in a broader context and keep a long-term perspective. Although your child may be too young to consider a long-term look on their own, you want to help them see that there is a future beyond the current situation and that the future can be good.
We model resilience, or we can work on resilience as well by modeling it. And so talking openly and honestly about things with our kids. If we struggle, mental health came up loud and clear in the questions. What if I struggle with mental health? I'm so terrified that my kids might struggle as a result of my own struggles or issues. But if they're seeing us model things like asking for help, taking breaks, using strategies, really positive for them. We want to be open and honest in a way that reduces the stigma of mental health. But our kids do look to us to have things together, and so we need to help them feel secure. So it's a balance of being open and vulnerable with them, but also knowing when to be in control and when to set the tone for safety, and that we've got this. It's okay for them to see us cry, but they also need to see us put ourselves back together and reach out for support so it doesn't feel out of control. It's always, when I think of resiliency, it always makes me think of Fred Rogers and look for the helpers. And I'm just always reminded that in our community and in this region, we always come together to support each other. No matter what happens in this community, I'm always amazed at the outpouring of support and how people really band together to support each other. And so through that, we foster resilience and we create hope. And I know the messages sound cliched, but remembering it's okay not to be okay. This won't last forever, and we can do hard things. And if we can continue focusing on resilience and hope with our kids, then I think we're better together. We can do this together as a community.
Yeah, thank you for allowing us to have this openly, this important conversation. The conversations can be difficult. Life can be difficult. Being a teenager can be difficult. This pandemic is difficult. Grief is difficult, and there is hope. Most of us will make it through trauma, through grief. Most of us will get through the teenage years, through our difficult years. Most of us will reach out and connect. We can make it through difficulty. We're not alone. This is the first time I've ever had my two superintendents listen while I talk for 2 hours. It's like amazing. I couldn't go anywhere. We're not alone.
So if you have signed up for one of the sessions, a consultation session at the end with one of our family school liaison workers, then feel free to ask questions, ask for resources. They are fantastic people that we have the pleasure of working with every day. But if your questions have been answered, hopefully some of them during this presentation, and you no longer feel the need for that, we would just ask that you go on and cancel your appointment so that it opens up for somebody else who might need some information. And thank you so much for your time and for welcoming us into your home tonight and asking such great questions. And thanks, Kevin.
Thanks for being here and sharing your questions and your concerns with us. This conversation is a really good start, and we are hopeful that this has opened the door for meaningful conversation, connection, and healing, so collectively we can take care of our people. We are a mighty strong community working hard to bring hope and help to those that need it. Stay well